Ladies and gentlemen, he does not need an introduction, but I will do so anyway. Mr. Ian Ritchie.
I was in Liverpool last night watching a great football match. So I thought I'd mention it, so I'm in a good mood. Glass is the answer, but what was the question? I'm just going to discuss, in a way, some ideas and something about users. But first, a bit of luck, I'm going to read a poem, which is actually my history, to explain, if you like, the breadth which I think is missing in architectural education. I came to architecture from the edge, somewhere between the edge of medicine and the edge of art, wanting to help people and to express myself. Both my humanity and my art were intuitive. I think I was lucky with my DNA and the access I had to nature's wonders. I lived on the edge of architecture, yet the actions were central. But I thought about society as much as form. I tried connecting architecture schools and investigating free time space and speculating on where urbanism was going. I realized architecture in East Anglia and saw egos and business competitiveness. I built real buildings with my own hands, then taught architecture, but not really. I had insufficient knowledge, but I shared buildings with students. Then, working, learning, and engineering at Arup, I worked with industry, I researched, I dirtied my hands in the workshop. And the boundaries of architecture that had begun to appear began to dissolve, and I saw that I was out on the edge. Then, a design engineering partnership in France. No boundaries, other than the sensual nature of buildings and streets, and materials, light, landscape, and technique. I remained on the edge, but in the center of French political ambition. A knowledge and feel for glass that brought me to the center, because the image was potent and sought after throughout Europe and later worldwide. But I had cracked glass. I moved outward again, weaving and deploying new materials. I now had knowledge, maybe even wisdom, out to the edge again, giving back to society. And now I write as much as I draw. My imagination is still on the rim of reason, and I do not know my next architecture, but my responsibility is still towards humanity. The Leipzig Glass Hall that you're watching there is its 21st birthday today, or last week, and it's immaculate. The robots still work and still clean it, and the client is exceptional. In 1999, for the new millennium, I wrote an essay for the Irish Times titled Zero the Hero, describing some of the public architecture Zero has given birth to and playing with some ideas of what it might stand for in relation to where we are headed as a society. In it, I described how around 628 AD, the astronomer Brahmagupta in India conceived of zero as part of a system of abstract mathematics. This opened up the possibility of negative numbers and a continuous number line stretching to infinity in both positive and negative directions, with the symbol zero, sunya, the nothingness, sitting at the boundary between positive and negative. Obviously, we all know it enables our entire system of mathematics to be at the very core of our society today. Zero can symbolize the beginning, the central point of balance between two forces, the trace of the infinite point. I suggest it also symbolizes the creative center, where synthesis replaces duality between subject and object, and where the creativity fed by the periphery takes form. In order to enter this creative space, architects or artists or scientists must breach the borders of the rational and the security of their psychological and intellectual limits. They must relinquish control to freely transplant knowledge between the sciences and the humanities. They must ask the right questions. Question what is self-evident in order to create something genuinely new, essential, and potentially meaningful. The periphery. For me, both personally and professionally, the periphery is a fertile place. It's an edge, a boundary zone, a frontier. When we speak of a frontier, we speak of a challenge. When we say something is cutting edge, we're talking of the most daring and creative manifestation of any field of knowledge or research. The wall came down, 1989, East met West, and Leipzig, with this building, we brought the sky down to the earth. In the natural world, boundary zones are the peripheries where ecosystems meet and are often the richest and most ecologically diverse. The same goes for when intellectual ecosystems meet. I'll quote Vitruvius, having given a paper here a few years back by Vitruvius and glass. Architects should be educated, first point, skillful with a pencil, instructed in geometry, know much history, have followed the philosophers with attention, understand music, have some knowledge of medicine, know the opinion or the opinions of the jurists, and be acquainted with astronomy and the theory of the heavens. I'm trying. I've performed as architect, engineer, thinker, urban advisor, artist, poet, writer, and critic, though I'm a dead loss at music, which is one of my great regrets. Control. Relinquishing control in the creative and interpersonal sense can open us to the thrill of creativity and the richness of cooperation and mutuality. The inadvertent or unwilling loss of control in the personal, professional, or cultural sense is another matter. That is when the center becomes empty, like the emptiness at the center of our consumer culture, designed never to be filled. And the periphery becomes neglected, forgotten, ignored, and discounted, a zone of danger rather than richness. Architecture without connexity. That's an Old English word meaning connectivity. We may not be the only animal that creates its environment, but we are the only animal which deliberately creates environments which are dysfunctional. We're social animals. Even nomadic peoples converge periodically to exchange news, trade goods and genes, celebrate or engage in spiritual rituals. We soon also realized that certain human activities can be conducted more easily when clustered together rather than dispersed. Villages, towns, and cities evolved and grew to fulfill human needs for centers of connexity. The great cities have always been the richest centers of connexity because they are the densest in population, diversity, complexity, races, cultures, and wealth. This is one reason they have absorbed invasions and outlived many and diverse systems of government. But more than centers of diversity, cities are complicated organisms with lives of their own, many-layered and culturally specific. They evolved in response to the surrounding environment and the unwritten, sensed needs and values of the communities which built them and were in turn shaped by them. There was a direct correspondence between the architecture of a city and its people. Architecture creates urban environments which mirror the philosophy on which our culture or a culture is based. Today's philosophy? Capitalism first, and with it the ubiquitous high-rise skyline. As the rich and powerful shape our world more than they did in the past, the glass towers sprouting in cities worldwide are monuments to wealth and might. And here I admit some culpability. I helped create facade engineering and the technology that makes them possible, which just goes to show that as designers, we can only make sure that what we create is adaptable enough to anticipate futures that are as yet undefined. Profit-driven development and ego-driven architecture are the manifestations of urban planning and architecture which no longer put society and cultural continuity at their center. The effect upon the buildings and public spaces and upon the global environment generally has been devastating. As cities lose their complex urban fabric of mutual influence and adaptation, they dehumanize the humanity that inhabits them and nature itself. These buildings express and evoke the least attractive aspects of the human psyche, selfish and egocentric. They stand alone and isolated. They do not share walls or face each other. They rarely make places welcoming to the street life, which makes a city live. They are urban spaces deliberately designed not to be lived in, but moved through, perhaps with a pause to buy a cappuccino. Corporate acquisition of large chunks of public space is further transforming cities, with implications for social structures and the richness of the urban fabric. On a larger urban scale, the answer to these problems is very much a matter of restricting the ability of private wealth to affect urban development. The free market approach of London makes this very difficult. But even here, control, for good or bad, can be exercised by individuals and communities with the will and power to influence the planning system. As the present Deputy Mayor of Paris, Jean-Louis Messica, who is responsible for architecture, urbanism, and economic development in the French capital, recently explained, we don't accept to give the management of public space to the private sector. The question of how you manage the design of the city, of the streets, and who has the right to be in the streets, and how you share the rights of the different users of the public streets is very decisive in future. You also have the question of social mixing, a city where the poor and the rich can be in the same spaces because segregation is the worst problem for cities. You see it in Paris, you see it in London. The city that accepts segregation is a dying city. And also in the words of Pasqual Maragall y Mira, who was the then mayor of Barcelona during that city's developments for the 1992 Olympics, he said to a room full of architects, "The exteriors of your buildings are the walls of our public rooms. So we will have a say about what they look like because we have to live with them." Even as an individual architect, you can remain aware that you're answering to the needs of the public as well as your client. The ability to discuss the design with the public is vital. In the case of the Sainsbury Welcome Centre, we consulted local interest groups and statutory authorities very early and extensively during the design process to ensure that the way the building plays with its urban environment and with its immediate neighbours and the public is welcoming. Control of the urban fabric isn't a utopian fantasy. In fact, it has been done successfully in Paris. And it's an example of what can be achieved when the right questions are asked during the process of city planning to produce a coherent philosophy. An anecdotal story, I met at La Villette in the north part of Paris, the then president of La Villette, Paul de Louvrier, who was a giant Mandarin of France. And he was asked as a 26-year-old, as an énarque, by the Secretary of President de Gaulle in 1954, would he like to get a philosophy of Paris together? You never hear that question ever raised in the United Kingdom, a philosophy for London. You will have strategy, strategy, strategy if you're lucky. He came back after 9 months and was reduced to tears because de Gaulle wasn't a great reader and he only read the first line. And the line was, "Paris risks falling into the Atlantic Ocean." From that, the French developed nuclear energy. They built the highways to move electricity across Europe. They created the TGV, and for fun, they built Concorde. They then subsequently did the east-west or west-east, north-south redevelopment of Paris. And in that redevelopment, we can smile here that we're getting our first crossrail next year. Paris, meanwhile, has built 4 quite quietly in the last 20 years. Nevertheless, urban design at a granular level is an extraordinarily complex endeavor. Even with the new technologies which can help planners and designers make sense of demographic and environmental data, public opinion, racial equality, and economic benefits. For not only reason, but also knowledge and theory are needed if we are to understand how buildings fit together to form civilized environments where communities can live in harmony and grace. And we must reclaim our memories, imagination, and emotion to create these environments. As we are slowly coming to the realization that in the rush to progress, we have left some of these behind, not only in architecture, but in our ways of relating to each other. So architects trying to regain connexity. The intellectual design and technical territory of the architect has been slowly eroded. There is no doubt that architects themselves and the way we are now educated have contributed to this. In current architectural teaching, the stress is placed upon knowledge and theory, the periphery, while emotion, which comes from within, the unquantifiable human heart central to architecture, is constrained, is considered sometimes immature when expressed strongly and unsupported by either knowledge or theory or both. Moreover, the architect's full range of skills, which used to be taken for granted, has become diluted through specialization and management. Few architects now design with a deep knowledge of structure, materials, environmental physics, cost of systems and construction, acoustics and lighting, combined with a really good understanding of politics, law, economics, social structures, urbanism, planning, construction, and the manufacturing industry. Without these skills, an architect is not able to advise on healthy urban infrastructure or to administer and control the process of delivering the building he has designed. That has been taken over by management. The result has been the subjugation of design to process and the separation of the two, with the power of management increasing at the expense of architecture. Conformity and ownerless decisions inevitably become management's allies. The growth of a risk-averse culture of chains of responsibility so long that nobody knows who is accountable have led to the marginalization of genuine experimentation, research, and innovation. It has also led to the marginalization of architecture in its broadest and most social sense, its ethical stance, because the values of architects and managers are different. I think that most designers and architects believe that they are essentially doing good. I think that idea doesn't enter most managers' heads. So the shift. The fundamental tragedy is that design, as in everything else in our present society, remains judged both qualitatively and quantitatively by the question, does it attract the consumer? Architectural space cannot realistically be in conflict with the commercial world, for it does attract or repel the consumer, and architects do not finance their own buildings, or rarely. But architects can recognize the real world of consumerism, and we can make architecture real within and beyond it. We are uniquely placed to provide the vision and to synthesize its spaces, their underlying structure and character and chameleon-like potential. We have the skills through our training and application that enable us to imagine extraordinary and memorable spaces, to enable them to be built, and to understand how they can be inhabited and enjoyed. They do not have to exist in isolation from the viewer or the user. They can be changed by their presence. Architects can create spaces which appear visually seductive, but do not consider the user, or is the user, in effect, being asked to adapt by changing himself? Who asks for the user's response after the initial attraction? How many architects live in their creations? How do they learn? How many contemporary architects will let their client or the users change their buildings without feeling aggrieved and complaining that their building is no longer what it really was? Can we as architects and engineers regain the ground we have lost by initiating a change in the negative aspects of our collective culture? I remain hopeful that we can, and we can help make a change by going back to the fundamentals. We can also stand firm on ethical issues and make our concerns public when we see unethical behavior within our professions. The late American architect Philip Johnson, one of the most influential in the 20th century, once said, "Whoever commissions buildings by me, I'm for sale, I'm a whore." I'll say that again, I'm a whore. The statement raised hackles in the architectural profession, as arrows into the center of a guilty conscience often do. Sometimes cognitive dissonance is required to reconcile ethical issues and the behavior of those paying the architect's fees. Important social and political issues relating to planning, design, and architecture often fall by the way. Very few architects take an ethical stand or refuse to plan projects that perpetuate social inequality. And not everyone can afford to be righteous, especially financially, but some can and do. Architects, designers, and engineers in industry, I think, should engage with the users of their products through wider lenses, those that look past the simple monetary and egocentric values of their products. This ink drawing is the first sketch that we did, or I did, having won a competition for the Sainsbury Welcome Centre. It was an OJU competition. It lasted 6 months, and we didn't draw a single line of a building. What we expressed was an understanding, or need to understand, where is neuroscience going, what is it doing, how do neuroscientists work, and how will they be working 50 or 60 years from now? And we set out a research program to find out. So we didn't know much about the universe or about our brains. And neuroscience research, as we all know, is focused on the brain, which you might be interested to know in Woody Allen's film Sleeper is his second favorite organ. That was a joke. The Sainsbury Wellcome Centre for Neurocircuits and Behaviour is a unique, world-class neuroscience research institute at University College London and was completed in 2015, with the final phase lab fit-out being done right now and be finished in a couple of weeks' time. It's taken 3 years nearly to actually hire the young guns, the young PhDs, and the principal investigators, because they wanted the best in the world. When you look at neuroscience laboratories, you have experimental, molecular, electrophysiology, cellular, developmental, structural, functional, evolutionary, and theoretical, computational, including neural networks. And the SWC has initiated and is now at the heart of a global research program called the International Brain Laboratory, which you may have heard about a couple of weeks ago. It's an ambitious project to answer one of the greatest mysteries of all time: how the brain decides what to do. The SWC was specifically designed from the inside outwards to give the scientists working in different fields of neuroscience the chance to meet easily and to encourage informal conversations and collaborations. Unlike other facilities purportedly designed with a similar goal, the design process of the SWC was made with the scientists themselves, central to the design process. This happened through monthly workshops from the very, very beginning to the occupation and post-occupation. John O'Keefe, the 2014 Nobel laureate, was then the interim director of the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre. He, along with Peter Dayan, who heads the Gatsby Computational Theoretical Unit, were our key scientific advisors, along with Russell Foster, professor of circadian neuroscience at Oxford, who discovered ganglion receptors, which is the other, if you like, instrument behind our eyes that actually picks up black and white. John O'Keefe's work has been on place cells within the brain, which help us navigate the environment. It also, along with boundary cells, head direction cells, and grid cells, those 4 types of cells are actually the GPS of our brains. Consider the threshold to a house, or crossing the road, or about to cross the road. All of these are sensed and processed by our brain, and we make choices about what to do next, very often on the basis of risk and reward. So we, as architects, design spaces and places. So what better partner for this project? We had to learn their language, and they had to learn architectural language. John O'Keefe subsequently coined the term neural architects for both the neuroscientists and us. So this is one of the first buildings in the world designed to incorporate what neuroscience has learned about how the spaces in which we live and work affect our mood and behavior. These include the scale of spaces, how they are perceived to be connected, and how wavelengths of light and sound inform perceived levels of comfort, privacy, etc. The laboratory and other areas of the building are uniquely adaptable. Single and double floor height spaces can be reconfigured, and many scientists use the services as a plug-and-play facility, designed to avoid the management team of UCL coming in and doing the work for them, because neuroscientists are bright enough to know how to move things. It is impressively energy efficient and is the first new building in the UK that uses a demand-controlled ventilation system. It's clad in a unique modularized white cast glass that's toughened and it's structural. It spans 4.2 meters and carries windows. You might ask the question, why windows for laboratories? An interesting response from UCL scientists at a very early conference. Half of them wanted windows and half didn't. So we put them in, which means that the air systems have to be quite sophisticated to overcome them opening them. But it's also about interaction. And there are ideas in this facade and at ground level and projected onto the building. And in the future, the building will become a tool in itself for research by neuroscientists. It's conceptually a metaphor of an iceberg. It expresses the melting of barriers between theoretical and behavioral scientists that the client wanted to achieve, as well as the climate change the Earth is undergoing. How well it actually functions is now being studied by a master's student with the help of the scientists working in the building. We know already that it's described as scale-free by some of the scientists, which is a term recently adopted by the neuroscientific community as a description of the brain's functional networks. They've also said it is a shockingly good building to work in, so that's encouraging so far. The future. I would like to be able to believe that with a greater understanding of why we react the way we do, and an empirical understanding of what we find beautiful and why, our reactions to beauty and what exactly makes the human spirit soar, is probably as good a place to begin as any. I have my own theory that beauty is simply non-linear. We might just be able to create not just buildings, which are good for humans, but cities and societies as well. As architects and as societies, I sense we are beginning to ask ourselves different questions. From where we derive our meaning, where do we place our meaning? And we see the fundamental altruism of humans every time there is a disaster. Tony Ritchie, the Swiss bridge builder, has built over 1,000 bridges in earthquake and devastated areas on his own, working only with the community, no money, and he now has ports in South America and in Southeast Asia stockpiled with pre-cut tubes given to him by companies in America and cable from Swiss companies and others. An extraordinary human being who simply went out and did it from the age of 18, instead of studying at ETH, engineering, becoming a professor, and ending up in nice restaurants. So we see the fundamental altruism of humans every time there is a disaster, when the collaboration and cooperation that is part of our instinct for survival takes precedence over the values imposed upon us by a competitive socio-economic system. We sense that being in touch with the natural world is crucial to our inner selves every time we take a walk through the woods, along a beach, or in the mountains. When we begin to recognize unbridled lust for wealth and power for what it is, a pathology which needs to be curbed by legislation if necessary, like any of the other addictions we recognize as damaging, we will be on our way towards a solution to what plagues our cities and societies. With luck, the compass will swing from due profit to due cooperation, toward a new paradigm predicated on the notion of sharing, a collective identity, and empathy with our fellow beings and with our environment. That's a consequence. We shouldn't underestimate it or forget it. Our Earth is 45 million centuries old, but this century is special. It's the first one when one species, ours, can determine the biosphere's fate. What a tragedy if we do not understand anything important about ourselves before we ruin the Earth. Is that what a black hole might really mean, and not Brexit? Thank you.